Well, welcome everyone here and everyone around the world. I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics, and it's my privilege to be on a stage with these three to talk about leveraging trade to reduce poverty. I have, in Bloomberg Economics, we have a lot of reporters and economists working on economics. I was congratulating our trade reporter in one of her many scoops, and she said, never a dull moment in international trade. And I had to assure her that, with Roberto's permission, I would say there had been many a dull moment, maybe over the years in international trade, and certainly international trade negotiations, but we are not living with many dull moments. It's obviously a big focus of attention, and rightly, because we are seeing the share of trade affected by protectionist measures going up. I was looking at bank figures suggesting that it's increased. The proportion is still relatively small, but has increased sixfold just since the end of 2017. And we know that distrust and concern about free trade, at least in some parts of the world, has perhaps increased even faster in the last few years and been taken advantage of by leaders from right and left, from non-mainstream voices. We can blame them for that lack of trust, but I think we probably also here would have to say that maybe global institutions and supporters of free trade had not been robust enough, perhaps, in making the case for free trade and for providing answers to the concerns that people have, better answers to the concerns. So I think this panel will be part of doing that and having an honest discussion around some of those issues. I'm not going to do long introductions, but of course, to my immediate left, we have the Chief Executive Officer of the World Bank, Kristalina Georgieva, and beside her, our token man for today, Roberto Azevedo, head of the World Trade Organization, and of course, Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF. Everyone's going to say a few words at the beginning, and then I hope we can have a lively conversation. Kristalina, this is your house. Let me start with you. What is so concerning to you at the moment about the trade uncertainty in the world and the potential risks that this might pose for poverty reduction and the developing economies?
Well, thank you for bringing that question of what does it mean for reduction of poverty. And it is bad news. We have a long history to prove that trade is good for growth, it is good for jobs, and it is good for poverty reduction. When we look at the projected future, by 2030, we are expected to go down to 3% extreme poverty. This is the global goal. All other things equal, today, at best, we will be at 6%. And if you live in sub-Saharan Africa, probably somewhere between 25 and 30%. And that, at best, is no more valid because a slowdown in trade, increased uncertainty, also means that it would serve as an additional factor that makes that achieving that goal of poverty eradication more difficult. So we have some research, most recent, that tells us that already we see an increase in poverty numbers by some 12, 13 million people. But there is a second reason we are very worried, because we know trade is also very good for peace. And conflicts are one of the biggest drivers of extreme poverty. If you look at history between 1970 and 2010, when trade was ratcheting up 7-fold increase in trade also coincides with 94% decrease in fatalities due to conflict. So trade makes the opportunity cost of war much higher. We have new research that shows that in the Great Lakes region, conflicts where people trade are 2.4 times fewer and less damaging. So we worry about that, breaking this link between trade and peace. And last but absolutely not least, we worry that we are mixing up apples and oranges. Yes, jobs are being lost, but mostly because of technological transformation and much less because of trade. And yet, we are allowing to pin on the back of trade the accusation for massive job loss. And you're right, we have a duty to relentlessly make the case for trade. And I'm going to finish with my favorite point on that, which is Vietnam. Anybody from Vietnam in the audience? Okay, fabulous case, because 80s, 90s, Vietnam cleaned up its plate in terms of barriers to trade. And what happened was poverty in Vietnam dropped from 60% to 3%. And I dream for that to happen in sub-Saharan Africa as well.
Christine, you've talked in the World Economic Outlook and elsewhere, I think last week, about the precarious state of the global economy, and obviously trade tensions play a part in that. But this week is about thinking about the world and not just the loud debates that come out of US and Europe. What does it mean for developing countries, that precariousness and the impact of trade uncertainties?
I want to also concentrate on what it means for them to have a lot of trade. And I would like to echo what Kristalina was saying regarding development, which is propelled by trade, peace, which is facilitated by trade. And I think that developing countries are much more at risk than many other countries in those two respects. So trade is critically important. I'd like to make 2 points. One is trade has been, is, and will be an accelerator of innovation, of productivity, and of growth. We've done joint studies between the bank, the WTO, and the IMF to demonstrate that to the face of the earth. So anybody who doesn't want growth should indeed not have trade. But I'm yet to meet a policymaker who says, no, I don't want any growth. That's not true. That's point number one. Point number two, it reduces the cost of living and has done so over the course of time in a differentiated way, if you will, because if you look at advanced economies and you look at high-income households, their cost of living has been reduced by 25% because of trade. If you look at low-income households, it is by 2/3 that their cost of living has been reduced as a result of trades. Now, it is not to say that trade is all good and perfect, and Kristalina alluded to that. The benefit of this current tension is that it really puts the finger on those that have been left out and left to the side, either because of trade or because of technology or because of both. And sometimes it's difficult to disentangle the two. And I think that's an entirely different chapter that needs big attention and budget spending and engagement from the public and the private sector to make sure that trade benefits all, which it doesn't necessarily at the moment. And that has been not sufficiently focused on. The second point I would like to make is that we don't need less trade, we need more trade. Because at the moment we have a lot of trade on goods, tangible products, but not much on services. And on services we have still a lot of non-tariff barriers, and tariff barriers for that matter, but Roberto knows much more than I do about that. But what I know for sure is that when you look at most economies in the world, they rely heavily on the service sector. You're talking about anywhere between 70 and more than 80% of those economies that are that is generated by a service activity. Well, service needs to be traded in a freer and fairer way. And all of you have telephones. Some of you are using it to register what's going on. You'll be able to send that to relatives or to friends or to do a little video out of it. Well, thanks to those technologies, a lot of those services are movable, tradable in a completely unimpaired way. That activity has to be freer, has to be easier to trade than it is at the moment. And I think it's a blessing that 76 countries back in, was it in January, have decided to join forces, not on a completely multilateral basis, but on a plurilateral basis, to move forward in terms of opening up of the trade in e-commerce, finally. So yes, we need more trade. We need to look at trade with a different pair of spectacles in order to ensure that everybody is included.
And the focus on services, I think, is very interesting. I think the Bank of England has estimated that if you had the same liberalisation for services that we've had for goods, you could also halve the excess current account imbalances that have also caused the tensions. I mean, Roberto, on this point, and more generally, I know that the digital e-commerce and services are a big part of your agenda for the WTO. And where does reducing poverty sit in that reform agenda, or as a driver for it?
It sits squarely in that conversation. But let me start by saying just very briefly that it's the second time in the span of a week that I'm the only man on the panel. So that is really great, and I hope that happens more and more often. But anyway, I think the key element to bear in mind when you're talking about new technologies, when you're talking about particularly electronic commerce, is the fact that it is an enabler for the small players. It reduces costs. It reduces particularly the costs of distance, of logistics. And for the small player, the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs, the cost of the transaction is fundamental. For the big company, uncertainties, the cost of the transaction is a line on the spreadsheet. For the small company, it means the transaction will happen or will not happen. It's as simple as that. And electronic commerce has the ability to lower the costs very, very significantly. We had a study recently that showed that if we in fact provide the right regulations, the infrastructure, the means in developing countries to benefit from the digital technologies to do trade, the percentage share of developing countries in global trade would jump from 43 to 57% in just 15 years. But that's a huge amount of potential that we see in this technology. The small companies also have a big advantage to them as far as society is concerned. Number one, they're the biggest providers of jobs. In most economies, they provide more than half the jobs in the economy. In some least developed countries, they provide more than 90%. Another fantastic characteristic of the digital trade is the fact that it induces more gender balance as well. One of the things that we have in our statistics is that the participation of women on companies that do online trade doubles compared to the women that participate in companies that are working solely offline. So all of these things clearly show that there is huge potential when you're talking about the digital economy, e-commerce, and that's something that we're trying to handle right now at the WTO. Christine just mentioned that initiative. We were in 2019, we are in 2019, and until this year, members were not truly talking about e-commerce in the WTO. So it is really something that we have to grasp. And just to conclude, and it's really sometimes incredible that I hear people saying that you know, discussions about e-commerce, particularly in the WTO, is going to simply crystallize and favor the big companies, you know, the mega multinationals, or you know, the big, huge platforms, and that's absolutely the opposite. If we do nothing, if there is no conversation whatsoever in terms of harmonization, facilitating the platforms and the participation of the small and medium enterprises in the digital economy, it is then that the global digital economy will be a preserve of the big companies, because they will survive. What we have today is a completely unregulated and undisciplined environment, which, by the way, for the small and medium enterprise is a deal breaker. Lack of information, lack of predictability, lack of rules. They don't make the rules, they don't play by the rules, they adapt to the rules that are made by the big ones. So this is something that I think we have to dispel, this kind of a misguided vision about what talking about e-commerce actually means in a global environment.
And that's actually something that economic research can help with. I see actually Michael Spence, the Nobel Prize winner, has written research which points out that if we maybe think there are mixed effects of e-commerce and the rise of the big internet giants in developed countries, actually the gains to the poor are much clearer and have maybe come more quickly in developing countries. I mean, Kristalina, is that a message that you've not managed to get across? This
is a message that we have to figure out how to get across. Just take one example, the Philippines. In 10 years, the Philippines have increased trade in services because of the internet 10 times. 10 years ago, they had 100,000 people in sort of outsourced services. Today, they have 1 million, 10 times more jobs. 10 years ago, they would export 1.4 billion as a result of that. Today, they export 18 billion. And that is just one of many, 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 many examples. And what is actually most rewarding to see is how that unleashes the potential for women. And I'm so glad you brought that point in. Among other things, when companies are not facing the owner or the workers, but especially the owner, women-led businesses flourish. When they go in the room and they meet whoever they're trading with, and it is a man, they may not get the business. They're online, you cannot see, is it a man, is it a woman? Boom, business goes up. So there are tremendous opportunities of unleashing trade in services, but especially of making sure that the internet is available everywhere for everyone. And on this one, I just want to make a point that is a very, very important point, that if we talk about trade, especially trade in services, but also in goods, and we do not think of a deepening digital divide, we are stopping in the middle of the road. Africa today has only 24% of people connected to the internet. The average for the world is 50%. You go in more advanced economies, it is 80+%. So to me, part of the issue around revitalizing trade, and if you wish, jazzing up trade, is to connect trade, especially in services, and access to the internet. We as institutions have made a commitment to Africa. We call it Africa Moonshot. And it is by 2030 to have every African citizen, business, and government service connected to the internet. And why this is so exciting? Because if that is Moonshot for Africa, that means the World Bank is NASA.
Okay, so enormous amounts of evidence. Enormous amounts of evidence. We're in favour of trade, but we know a lot of people are not in favour of trade, and we know that there are reasons for that. Christine Lagarde, I was struck by a quote from Danny Roderick, who is a sort of thoughtful critic of globalization. He said, "There's been an unspoken rule of public engagement for economists that they should champion trade and not dwell too much on the fine print." You mentioned some of the fine print in your remarks. There have been ways that there's complexities, there's policies that need to happen with trade to make the gains be shared with people. What kind of policies is the IMF pushing, and maybe needs to be more robust in pushing all of the institutions to build up this support for trade and make it inclusive?
Stephanie, in a way, I should use this thing. Maybe, yeah. It's better. You can hear me better now. I was going to say, Stephanie, it's not necessarily related to trade. And what we see in many countries is the importance of domestic policies having to do with the labor market. Because the reality, and for some the perception, is that by virtue of trade happening elsewhere, my job, their job, is disappearing. My industry is being relocated somewhere else. My types of jobs is farmed out elsewhere. Cheaper, better organized, supply chain fragmented all over the place. And at the end of the day, my job and my living is vanishing. So we're not going to help that situation with trade. Trade should continue. Trade should accelerate, provide this innovation, provide this productivity, and provide this reduced cost of living that I was talking about. But there should be passive and active labor policies in place in order to enable those people who feel that they are disenfranchised, their jobs are gone, their activity is disappearing, that will equip them to actually move to other areas of activity, to other industry, to acquire new skill sets. Now, you're going to say, and I would echo you, oh, okay, it's all business about education and lifelong training. Yes, it is, actually. But what at least we can do at the IMF is look into countries that have succeeded. And what we have done is look at those countries that are most likely to be affected by trade. And you're talking about those that are either at the lower end of the scale of the supply chain, or you're also looking at very small economies that rely heavily on trade and that want to equip their workers with the skill set to adjust to the next trade. And you look at what countries like Singapore, like Denmark, like Sweden, like Germany are doing. And those, I'm mentioning those four because we've looked in details at what kind of labor policies they have in place, both active and passive. And you can actually tell that when there is smart training, on-the-job training, which is now, there have been studies right, left, and center to show that it's on-the-job training that actually works, rather than off-the-job training that works. Second finding is that when it is anticipated, when transition is facilitated, it's far more effective. Number three, it's on the job, but it's also helping people to get themselves up to the next job, which works as well. And surprise, surprise, in those countries, you see relatively low levels of unemployment. And even through crises which have seen trade go down, as we have seen post-2008, the unemployment numbers didn't go very high at that moment, at those moments, simply because there were policies in place that were helping people along through unemployment benefits, through training, on the job, through cooperation between the public and private sectors. And I would say that, you know, to those who doubt trade, I'd say trade in and of itself will not be sufficient. It needs to be supported, accompanied by lots of other policies, and labor policies will be critical at that point in time.
But when you think about developing countries, I mean, that is clearly those kind of things. But I was struck, the research that the bank has done, that in sort of as a background to this event, was quite honest about the impact of trade liberalization in some countries where there wasn't enough effort to get out to the rural area. Actually, people in the rural area sometimes suffered, even though the other populations benefited. I mean, there is a lot of nuance in those studies that we have to grapple with.
Well, that is a space for honesty, indeed. Unless we understand what is the impact of policies, especially on the poor and most vulnerable, and then we think through measures that can be put in place to protect against this impact, then we would have a, well, backlash, but even worse, we would have negative consequences for people. So what we do at the bank, let me first say that I agree entirely with Christine on active labor policies, but also what we do at the bank is to be much more conscious of what policies we can recommend that provide social safety nets to people. But more interestingly, what policies we can provide, we can promote that offer social safety ropes that help people to help themselves. And we find that it is, of course, about access to finance, access to managerial accounting support for new entrepreneurs, access to fast internet, and that to us, I can say very humbly, we realize that what we used to do in a fast-moving world is just simply not enough. We have two major initiatives at the bank. One we call human capital, investing in people, making sure that countries have more agile, easily deployable labor force. And the second one is around this understanding of policies that promote entrepreneurship and self-reliance rather than policies, traditional safety nets that sort of put money in the hands of people but don't really create that opportunity to rely on yourself. I just want to make one additional point on that issue of differentiating between technology and trade. And the point comes actually from a study we did for the European Union. We looked at the last decade and we found out that the EU lost 15% old jobs, low-skilled jobs. And the EU gained, guess what, 15% new jobs. So you look at this and say, what's your problem? 15 gone, 15 came, it equals, right? But it doesn't, because the people who lost their jobs do not have the skills to migrate into the new jobs. And that all, in fact, has not only social consequences, but political consequences. If you look at the political landscape in Europe and the rise of populism, part of it is grounded in that reality. And again, we have to admit it, understand it, have measures against it, but not fall in the trap to call all of it a consequence of trade. In fact, when we studied it, it is a small proportion that is driven by changing trade patterns. It is a big proportion that is driven by technological change.
But
Stephanie, can I just make one point in response to your question about developing countries? Because we have to look and dig into the trade numbers and how the trade flows are engineered. And we had a really interesting study done on sub-Saharan African countries to see what the impact of the Pan-African trade recently negotiated and now finally in place regional agreement. And it's fascinating to see that most of the trade between sub-Saharan African countries and the rest of the world is dominated by commodities, 84% roughly. But then you look at the trade between sub-Saharan African countries. And obviously you have the issues of infrastructure, of the last mile and all the rest of it. But most of the trade between African countries, which will be the food for this Pan-African free trade agreement, that is not commodities. It is manufacturing products. It is value-added products. So I think the different layers of trade vary, and I don't think we can say, as a result of trade tensions, there will be an impact. It's going to be differentiated depending on the nature of trade that countries have amongst themselves and with the rest of the world.
And Roberto, we have, you know, the kind of honesty that, and sort of honest conversations around the things that need to be better in trade liberalization, but also in policies generally. I mean, how much do you think, you know, how much is that part of the conversation that you want to have in the WTO when you're thinking about trade? Because it certainly, you know, it's accepting the small part that's a problem, which gives you more credibility in making the larger claims, and that is obviously true for the WTO as well, in thinking about people's attitudes to trade.
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe start answering the question, just hammering down one point. When we talk about trade, and Kristalina was saying just now, the problem is that you know, the fact that you're creating jobs is more than you're losing, or roughly equaling that, that's no consolation for the person who lost his job. So that has a political impact, and trade is not going to resolve that. It is not. So there clearly is a job for, you know, governments to handle, and that's up to them to begin to work on those kind of policies that Christine was just talking about. Now, what we cannot is forget the big picture. The big picture, we just recently, we had the economists in Geneva. We asked them to make a calculation. What would happen if we didn't have the WTO overseeing tariffs, for example? So the bindings, you know, the contracted tariffs. And they looked at what they call a worst case scenario, which is, suppose there were no rules and members were, and countries were determining tariffs unilaterally, in whatever level that they feel comfortable. Now with that one, and that's not even the worst case scenario, and there are scenarios which are worse than. I'm not saying we stop trade, I'm just saying tariffs will go up, you know, freely. And the result of that simulation was that the global economy would grow slower by 2%, or contract by 2% in terms of the baseline. That, by the way, is worse or just about as bad as the recession we had, or the acceleration we had after the crisis in 2008. That's the importance of trade. 17% only of trade disappeared. And that's the impact that you have in the global economy. Now imagine what that means in terms of unemployment, in terms of lost opportunities, in terms of contraction of salaries. I'll give you another one. Another simulation we made was on what if trade stopped? What would be the impact? And funny enough, I went to a seminar, and this gentleman, he was explaining the result of surveys that they made. And one of the questions in the survey was, do you believe that trade reduces prices, you know, on the shelves? And in not one single country, and there were more than 40 countries that they did this survey, not in one of them did the response come back, yes, it reduces prices on the shelves. Not one. Now that's economics 101. Right? So that's the basics of economics. So there's a lot of misperception out there. What really, you know, what really would happen if there was no trade whatsoever? The poorer segments of society would be the ones that will lose the most. There was, I think, a UCLA study that came out. 63% of purchasing power could be lost in the poorer segments of the economy. So that means if you have a salary of $1,000 a month, without trade, your salary would actually be 3,700 out of 1,000. That's the kind of impact that this has. So in the WTO, I think what we're trying to do is not only to make sure that we have predictability, because predictability is absolutely critical for trade. It is also that we have inclusiveness. So a lot of what we're doing now is about facilitating trade and trying to make sure that trade benefits reach everyone. So there are conversations now on small and medium enterprises. There's a group of almost 80 countries that is talking about how to make things better for a small and medium enterprise. E-commerce is another one. There's another group that is doing facilitation of investments, how to make investments flow better for developing countries. Another one that is about empowerment of women that we're doing. So this is how I think the WTO can help, is to ensure that the rules, the disciplines that we put in place actually translate into getting more people benefiting from trade.
You say focus on the big picture, and it should be up to governments to do some of these active things and to help with the dislocations. But I guess the risk is if you just leave it to governments and they don't do it, then you potentially endanger the whole system, because the support goes and people take advantage of the dislocations. So I guess I'm wondering whether there should be more of a more sort of muscularity, if you like, in getting governments to push on those policies at the same time as doing liberalization, rather than thinking the job is done with the liberalization.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing we have to do is take them off the comfort zone. And that's what the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, we have been putting out studies, you know, and saying, look, you guys have a job to do. Right? You can't rely on an answer that is going to come from the skies or from international organizations. We can do that for you. We can help. We can inform. We can give you the path. But at the end of the day, it is governments that will have to do that. And we cannot do that for them. In our study that came out, I think, a year and a half ago, maybe. Yeah, 18 months ago, it's about that. It's precisely about that. But if governments do not realize that or do not begin to respond, it is never going to happen, because governments and politicians, they respond to elections. All right? So education, training of the labor force, these are long-term policies. The results of those policies will take maybe 5, 10, 15 years. The results will be tremendous for the society, but it's going to be maybe 7, 8, 10 years from now. Now, they're looking at a couple of years from now. So they need a scapegoat. I can't be doing the wrong thing. So something is happening here. It's not my fault. So it is, you know, imports from a country or two, or it is some, you know, immigrants or a labor that is moving and coming in and disrupting things. It's easier. So the search for the scapegoat overrides the real diagnosis. And I think that's what international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO have the duty to perform, which is make sure that the facts and the real diagnosis is out there.
I wanted to raise something else, another sort of challenge to this, which comes from a different direction, and you've all mentioned it already, which is technology. But Kristalina, you should listen to my podcast this week, because it's about your favorite country, Vietnam, which you mentioned earlier. We are talking to them about the benefits they have seen, funnily enough, from the US-China trade war because of some diversion. But if you look at a country like Vietnam, and you look, that is a classic model of development that we have, that is very much a trade-led model of development. You move along and you move up the value chain, and it's a very familiar story. But a question is now being raised about whether other countries will be able to walk that path, whether they'll be allowed to by the global system, but also whether it'll even be available, because the same producers who might have been wanting to get cheaper workers in Vietnam, who are currently using more expensive workers in China because wages are going up, are now saying, well, I could go to Vietnam, or I could just put robots in the factory. So how does that change this sort of our vision of trade as an enabler?
The traditional way, of course, is being challenged, it's being changed. You go to Bangladesh, where textile is the big driver of growth and jobs. Now they're importing robots from Germany, and instead of having mostly women working in the factories, they have robots. We have to all adjust to this reality, but I just want to say one thing that sometimes we forget about. I think Christine touched upon it a bit, that when we talk about drivers of growth and trade, we always think of these big multinational flows, and yet if I think of Africa, for example, there is so much that can happen, just Africans trading with each other and being able to move across borders. If we go back in history, as human race, from the very moment we became economically active, we actually trade. I produce what I'm good at, and I trade it for what you produce, what you're good at. And that, I cannot imagine that we become so dumb to forget that very simple principle, that division of labor and specialization make us all better off. And in that area, there is one thing that we don't talk enough about, and it is not tariffs, but it is trade facilitation. In other words, reducing the barriers for countries to trade. I have from my colleagues, my favorite example is Honduras and Guatemala. So they used to, just because of barriers of crossing the borders and custom duties and custom checks, they used to take an average of 10 hours for a truck with goods to cross the border, 10 hours. So the drivers would have hammocks, and they would be waiting there for the 10 hours. Now, trade facilitation means that it dropped from 10 hours to 15 minutes. So there is a negative trade impact for the producers of hammocks, but beyond that, and that we look at, in fact, our studies say that if Africa was to reduce by half the trade facilitation barriers, the GDP of Africa would be boosted by 12%. If Africa eliminates tariffs entirely, GDP would go up by 5%. So my point here is that we have to be persistent of always pursuing the best economic interests of countries, and actually go out and tell the stories of why we would be completely lost if we give on specialization and trade.
Christine, did you want to also, I mean, I'm interested in your perspective on this point of, whether technology, automation sort of changes the way we think about the development path for countries and the role of trade, or do you think it's part of the story that we've already been familiar with?
I think it is. I think technology is going to force us to change the way in which we think about taxation, about competition, about trade. The fact that we have focused so much energy on the trade of products, when the trade of services is such a huge, big mine of additional exchange, productivity, improvement, room for innovation. So I do think that technological breakthroughs are going to change all of that, and it's an economic factor. It's one that gives us hope, actually. If there was no technological breakthrough, maybe we would be stuck with low productivity, low inflation, low interest rates, low growth, low unemployment. So yes, I do think that it will impact trade. You know what I find fascinating, and I was listening to us all talking, and we are all a little bit miserable about trade, and yet you are so popular at the moment, right? whether you're a token man or a scapegoat, you are unbelievably popular because all the complaints are coming to you. You have a huge amount of complaints for breach of rules, for non-respect of such and such principles, for additional violation of WTO. You have a very large amount of that. The trade dispute resolution, and I very much hope that it will be fixed before December, is loaded with cases to be heard and to be found. Added to that, if you look at the number of trade agreements around the world at the moment, whether it is on a bilateral or on a plurilateral basis, or at that sub-level that you have advocated, Roberto, in e-commerce and in investment, for instance, there is a flurry of activity. Canada, Europe, Japan, Africa, TPP 11, which is now enforceable within 7 countries. It just goes on and on and on. So I think that it's difficult to find somebody who is against trade. So we need to get to the bottom of what is the matter with the way in which we handle trade and the way in which the governing system that we have can be improved, will be improved, and will keep people together. The 76 countries that came together on e-commerce in January include China and the United States of America, for instance. So come on, let's look at the half-full glass and make sure that we can actually try to fix what's not working as well as expected, I hope.
I feel guilty because I didn't quite directly answer your question. And your question was, is technology going to change? Yes, it will change the pattern of growth, drivers of growth. What is not going to change is that it would be comparative advantage that determines how we specialize and in what we specialize. And what we see now in developing countries is that there is actually much more in opportunities for jobs and growth that comes with technology than is being completely wiped out. Problem is speed of adjustment. And those who are more agile, adjust faster, they benefit. And that actually means that for institutions like ours, we need to be much more active in helping countries have that agility, policy agility, that would make it possible for them to be among the winners. But I do worry about the risk of digital divide, of countries falling off the cliff because they are not part of this new economy. I worry about that. And as I worry, at the same time, I think of this as a huge opportunity. Africa can leapfrog. We see that countries can move faster on that basis. And whether they would do it or not depends on many factors, on political will in the country, but it also depends on our unity of purpose. And one fantastic thing about this panel is unity of purpose we do have. Some are more popular than others.
Well, I think that's we've run out of time, and I think it's nice to be able to end on a positive note. But Roberto, do you, as the most popular man on this panel...
Well, look, talking about popularity, I remember, look, I've been doing this for a while, so I was in Seattle, and I remember, all the demonstrations against the WTO, and even in Geneva, and it was a very interesting scene that I saw recently during the manifestations for Brexit, and I saw these demonstrators on the streets with, the signs reading, "I love WTO." So I thought, that's fantastic. I never saw that. So we're in a new world, certainly. And I think the story that we get there is, imagine if there were no WTO, and Brexit was actually happening. The degree of unpredictability would be absolutely incredible. Incredible. At least today, even if Brexit happens in a hard way, and I hope that is not the case, that there will come an agreement, but if at least people can imagine what the world is like, what it's going to be like in case there is no agreement. And that kind of predictability, if it is important for the big ones, imagine for the small ones.
Well, you are now not popular with me because I was hoping that we would get through this whole panel without talking about Brexit. But it is certainly true that British people are learning new enthusiasm for free trade, and indeed for Europe in this whole process. But maybe now we know the next one of these, we should be showing a film, the WTO version of It's a Wonderful Life, where you get to see the vision of the future in the past without the WTO.
I actually want to, because he has been so fantastic, I want to make a pledge that at the World Bank we would never have a panel without at least one man.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. And I know there's also been a lot of questions that have come in from online that we haven't had a chance to answer. But it was good to be on a positive note. And I think in the World Economic Outlook this week we hear that 80% of people are still favourable about trade, even if they're not quite sure what benefits it produces. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.